مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. المنافسة هي اليوم الكلمة الأساسية في الشؤون الدولية، وهذا يعني أن هناك مباراة بين الدول، ليست مباراة ودية ولكنها ليست مباراة دامية أيضا. من خلال المنافسة تعارض الدول بعضها البعض بطرق مبطنة، ولكنها لا تتقاتل بالأسلحة والدبابات والطائرات، على الأقل حتى هذه اللحظة. من هذا المنطلق كلمة المنافسة هي الوصف الأدق للوضع بين الصين والولايات المتحدة، علما أنه لا تدور معركة كبيرة بينهما من الناحية الاقتصادية. ففي الربع الأول من عام 2023 نمت الولايات المتحدة اقتصاديا بنسبة أكثر من 1%. خلال الوقت نفسه نمت الصين بنسبة 4.5%. لماذا تنمو الصين اقتصاديا بصورة أكبر من الولايات المتحدة؟ هل هذا الاختلاف هو حقيقي ومستمر؟ وهل يؤدي النمو الاقتصادي إلى نمو القوى سياسية وعسكرية؟ لمناقشة التنافس العالمي بين الولايات المتحدة والصين يسعدني أن أرحب بديفيد ريني، إدوارد أولدريتش وباولو فان شيراخ. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. It's the new catchphrase in Washington these days for everything having to do with foreign affairs: great power competition. Let's see what great power competition means in the economic realm, looking at the United States and China. Two big numbers came out recently, growth figures for our two countries. For America, first quarter growth, 1.1%. For China, 4.5%. Let's look at what each of these mean and then try to figure out what it means together with a group of outstanding panelists: Edward Alden, Paolo van Schirach, and from Beijing, David Rennie. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm delighted that you could be with us. So, David, let me begin with you. China emerging from COVID. How damaging was the pandemic, and what did China do to counter it economically?
The really interesting thing is that, many months after the rapid abandonment of those very strict pandemic controls, we still don't have a really clear idea about whether China has kind of sprung back to life, is open for business and firing on all cylinders, or whether actually there are lingering effects, and particularly whether global slowdowns are going to really hurt China's ability to do what it has done so many times before, which is to ride an export boom by selling to countries around the rest of the world. And so, there are some good numbers, and you talked about them at the top of the segment, but they've also just had some quite recent trade numbers, which were a little worrying for China, because in particular, what they showed is that China's customers in the rest of the world are buying less from China. And you can see signs that factories are actually getting ready to slow down a bit, because China imports, raw materials, the iron ore, the copper, the kind of basic commodities that they turn into all those goods. And those imports seem to be slowing as well. So you have to ask, global questions now when you ask about the health of the Chinese economy. And so even if China is very confident that it's emerged from the pandemic in reasonable shape, if the rest of the world isn't sending that demand to China, then China as an export-focused, or still a very export-focused economy, isn't going to be able to do without that demand from the rest of the world.
So, Edward, when you look at the Chinese economy, what word or phrase describes it for you? Is it a mature economy? Is it a mercantilist economy, a state-controlled economy? How would you characterize the Chinese economy?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of those. David is much more of the China expert than I am, but I think China's in a situation where obviously in aggregate, an enormously large and influential economy. We learned this week China has now become the largest auto exporter in the world, which is quite a stunning development. And I think there's the potential a whole array of future economic shocks associated with Chinese capacity. But at the same time, China doesn't have the per capita wealth yet of many of its successful Asian neighbors, like a South Korea or a Japan. And so I think it faces the struggle of trying to maintain high levels of economic growth to continue meeting the economic needs of its population. I think, as David's pointing out, I think the environment for that is getting more and more difficult, especially for an export-oriented economy like China.
And Paulo, what in your view is the connection between everything we're talking about, the Chinese economy, and Xi's vision of Chinese power looking out into the future?
Well, again, I defer to my distinguished colleagues for maybe more hands-on experience on this, but clearly it seems to me that since Xi Jinping came to power and consolidated power by eliminating all possible opponents and challengers to his absolute rule, we've seen the reassertion of the Communist Party as the leader of everything, and including on economic strategies and indeed corporate management as well. Each company now in China has its own statutory Communist Party, I would say commissars, for lack of a better word, that tell them what to do. So that's the model. I am not confident, notwithstanding the impressive success of China, if we look back to Deng Xiaoping and his momentous transformations of the Chinese economy that he unleashed, and up to today, it's an incredible success story, undeniably so. But it seems to me that this effort of making China into the Chinese economy as state-run by the Communist Party ultimately, I don't know that this is successful. I am not a believer in autocracies being promoters of genuine innovation. And this is the future. Let's leave aside for the moment the quarterly GDP figures, who does better or worse. But long term, is China poised to become the leading technological power and innovative power, determining standards in future industries, like the United States has been, for better or worse, since World War II? I am not that confident that this model works, notwithstanding the tremendous successes that China has had for the past 30 years. But clearly, we're way past the 10% a year growth rates that dominated the 80s and the 90s. And so we'll have to see if in the global struggle to become the preeminent innovator, which I really think that's the future of who wins the prize, the one who establishes standards, the one who dominates the technological fields. And I'm not sure if the United States can recover some of the lost ground, but I am not totally confident that China's model is better.
All right, so we'll get to the United States piece of this in a minute, but David, how do you see the connection between Xi's vision for China and the specific discussion of the state of the Chinese economy?
So it's a good question. You're asking about the politics, really, of the economic situation in the kind of short and the long term. I think we should pick up Paulo's excellent decision to make a distinction between today's GDP numbers, how fast is the Chinese economy growing, and China's ability to innovate and set standards for the industries of the future in decades to come. And I think Xi Jinping has a political stake in both of those questions. So right now, even if the economy is, as you said at the beginning, growing more rapidly than the American economy, it isn't growing fast enough in certain sectors to generate, for example, jobs for recent university graduates. And that, in the short term, is quite a political problem for the Communist Party, because you have record numbers of people going into university education. This is one of their big bets on having a better educated workforce. So I think it's 11 million, over 11 million young people will graduate from Chinese universities this year. There are not 11 million graduate jobs waiting for them. We've actually seen a very interesting, now somewhat censored, discussion online here in China about young people saying there are no graduate jobs, and I went to all the effort of getting a graduate degree or going through a bachelor's degree. And the Chinese Communist propaganda machine saying, well, maybe you shouldn't be too choosy. Maybe you should be so stuck up. Maybe you should settle for a non-graduate job, and getting a lot of pushback from young people about that until it was also censored. So the short-term politics of GDP growth are exceedingly political for Xi Jinping and a Communist Party that has, for so long, put economic growth as a core plank of its kind of promise to the Chinese people that, if you basically don't get involved in politics, if you defer to Communist Party authority, life will keep getting better every year and the country will feel more prosperous and your future will be kind of brighter every year. They can't afford for that to slow down very much. But what is really interesting, to turn to Paolo's point about the long term, is that we are also seeing Xi Jinping issuing very clear political statements that China is, if you like, under siege from an America that is trying to use things like controls on exports of the highest technologies, things like the most advanced, powerful chips and semiconductors that America does not want American companies or even companies from allies in Europe and Asia selling to China. China feels that these vital technologies, these vital high-tech imports are being choked off by an America that is determined to try and hold China down. So we're seeing Xi Jinping, in addition to that short-term conversation about economic growth, making speech after speech where he says, but of course, beyond economic growth, the most important thing is national security and supply chain resilience and not being dependent on a hostile foreign world, avoiding what he calls chokehold, stranglehold technologies. And so you see that in the balance between kind of economic growth and being independent of a hostile American sort of supply chain, Xi Jinping is signaling again and again at the moment that he is willing to take national security as the top priority. And so that then feeds into Paolo's excellent question about what is that degree of Communist Party control, that focus on security, what will that say about the next few decades of China's economic momentum?
All right, when we come back after the break, Edward, I'm going to shift gears, ask you about America's more sluggish growth, and then we're going to try to bring both these stories together and make some analysis about the competition between our two countries in just a moment. And our guests again today include David Rennie. David is the Beijing bureau chief at The Economist. Previously, he was the European Union correspondent, the British political editor, and the Washington bureau chief. In these posts, he authored the Charlemagne, Beigho, and Lexington columns. Also joining us is Paolo von Schirach. Paolo is president of the Global Policy Institute, a Washington-based think tank. His research focuses on contemporary world politics, economics, and international trade. Previously, he was affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Georgetown University, the London School of Economics, and the University of Pisa. And joining us is Edward Alden. Edward is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in U.S. economic competitiveness, trade, and immigration policy. He's the author of the book, Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. So Edward, let's pick up with you, talking about failure to adjust. The numbers coming out here in the United States, first quarter, 1.1 growth, fairly sluggish. Why are we not emerging from the pandemic at the speed that the Chinese are emerging, evidently?
Well, I mean, I actually think the latest quarterly numbers were about the best anyone was hoping for. I mean, what we've seen now is a year plus of steady tightening by the Federal Reserve to try to bring what were uncomfortably high levels of inflation under control. The U.S. job market remains astonishingly strong. Unemployment is basically at record low levels, which is a double-edged sword, of course, because that tends to fuel wage growth, which may lead the Federal Reserve to further interest rate increases, though the last meeting suggested we may be in for a bit of a pause. So the U.S. economy is actually looking like it's in a pretty good spot. I mean, I think the political concern for the Biden administration is that we see a sharper slowing later in the year and into next year, which has some political implications for 2024. But if I could, I'd actually just like to pick up on David's final point about Xi Jinping's concern for national security over economic growth. I think everything he said about China in his last several sentences, you could say about the United States today. I think the primary concern of not just the administration, but the Congress as well, is supply chain security, reducing or ideally eliminating what the United States sees as a Chinese chokehold on a range of critical technologies that are vital for the industries of the future, electric vehicles most prominently, but there are many others as well. And I think you have a United States that's willing to pay a price in economic growth, a price in inflation, because to the extent that you reduce China's role in the supply chain, that's going to feed inflation. You have a United States that is prepared to do those things in the interests of national security and reducing dependence on China. So we're really seeing here the mirror image of what David is describing as Chinese economic and security priorities.
Paulo, there really is a bipartisan understanding in the United States. There aren't too many of those. A bipartisan understanding about China and this shift in our economy. Both parties talk about America first in terms of our economic purchases and investments. Do you see this deepening recognition that at least in an economic realm, this is now the status quo in American politics?
Indeed, I do. Thank you. Let's consider in February 2021, when Biden had been in the White House for a month, issued an executive order, ordering a whole of government effort to move away from China-based supply chains. It's a very detailed document that gives sort of chapter and verse about what are we going to do and which agencies deputized to do this and that and the other to coalesce and steer American business away from China and either inshoring production or, as now the fashionable term is, friendshoring, right, to move away from China but into other countries that are more friendly to the United States politically and in terms of overall governance issues. So I think, oddly enough, there is, as you say, a fundamental agreement between Democrats and Republicans here in Washington who don't agree on anything, including the time of day, on the fact that China represents not an economic competition issues, but an existential threat. We are down to this element to say the Chinese are trying to subvert the rule-based order that America was instrumental in creating after World War II and creating the China-centric world order, a re-edition of the Middle Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, where China is at the top and everybody else is a tributary state, which was the Chinese imperial model of long ago. Now, whether this is correct or not, I am not sure, but there seems to be substantial agreement that this is indeed the challenge we're facing. And therefore, there is a concerted effort here in Washington to convince American industry, but also other countries to say, hey, watch out, you don't understand what you're doing. Europe, friends, Western allies, don't cozy up with China because you will be sorry if you become dependent on and become subservient in some fashion to Chinese interests and whatnot. So this is where we are right now. And so it's a mixture of economic policies and national security priorities and the concern that the world order that we built or we contributed in building and maintaining is going away, to be replaced by a China-centric order in which the Chinese Communist Party is now not exporting revolution, but is exporting its own state capitalism model and cozying up with African leaders and others and say, hey, we're going to do this and that for you. We don't care about human rights and governance and corruption as long as you do business with us.
The United States is going to restrict export of critical security-related technologies, try to retard China's military development, but otherwise have a reasonably mutually beneficial trade relationship.
So it sounds like this is a topic that we're going to be returning to quite a bit in coming months and years. I'm afraid we need to call it there because of our time, but I want to thank all of you for opening up the aperture on this, and we will come back to take a look, because I'm quite sure that as our politics heat up here in America, this issue will be at the top of the political agenda. Thank you, David Rennie, Edward Alden, and Paula Van Schirach for joining us on Dachel, Washington. Some countries are teetering on the edge of total financial collapse because of Mount Everest-sized corruption, like Lebanon, which has suffered one of the greatest Ponzi schemes in human history. Other countries are teetering on the edge of financial collapse because of a mix of mismanagement, overspending, and enormous need, which characterizes the situation in Egypt, a once proud nation that is now the world's largest importer of food, stuck in a global food crisis. And then there are countries teetering on the edge of financial collapse because of the overweening ego of their politicians, who think playing Russian roulette with a nation's economy is a mark of statesmanship. That characterizes the situation here in the United States, where a growing economy enjoying the lowest unemployment rate in decades may be sent into a devastating tailspin by congresspeople who are extorting the president, Congress, and the people of America to bend to their will. Otherwise, they will refuse to vote the necessary increase in the government's debt limit, without which we will default on our debt and destroy one of the greatest assets America has, the full faith and credit of the United States, the asset that makes the American dollar the mightiest currency in the world. Yes, our current law is bizarre and deserves to be ditched. In almost no other country does the national legislature have to cast what is essentially a political vote to allow the nation's treasury to pay debts accumulated through votes the legislator already made to approve spending bills. But getting rid of the debt limit vote, as prudent as that would be, would deprive demagogues of the opportunity to blackmail the system, which is what is happening right now. Now, I have some sympathy for Republicans who want to rein in spending, though not a lot, given that our budget was last balanced by a Democrat, Bill Clinton, and that Republicans bear as much blame for our current deficit as Democrats. But I have no sympathy for those Republicans who want to hold our country hostage to achieve their spending goals, threatening to destroy the dollar to get their way. And I have even less sympathy for Republican leaders who pander to this idiocy in order to maintain their position or to weaken the president. There's a time for grandstanding, and there's a time for statesmanship. And raising the debt limit clearly belongs in the latter category. Let's do what we have done before. Create a national commission of experts, scholars, and retired politicians to examine our government spending and propose ways to get back to a balanced budget. They can produce the unpalatable but bipartisan solutions that today's politicians may have to accept to move our economy forward. But let's de-link the debt ceiling from that process. Otherwise, there may not be much of an economy left to save. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثير التنافس الاقتصادي بين الولايات المتحدة والصين على بقية العالم، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.